Chapter 10 covers glaciers, deserts, and wind. What we'll look at in this chapter are the types of erosion and features that are left behind by erosion due to glaciers and wind. And then we'll look at depositions that can occur due to glaciers and wind. So when we look at glaciers, glaciers are thick masses of ice that are going to form from the land or form over land, and it may take hundreds or thousands of years. It's going to originate from accumulation, compaction, and recrystallization of snow. So we get accumulation of snow. So we're going to have to be in an area where we have pretty pervasive snowfall. That snowfall is going to become compacted over time, and it may thaw and refreeze or recrystallize. Glaciers appear to be motionless, but they're not. They do move. They move very slowly, but they do move. And as we'll see, as we look at some of the landforms that are caused by glacial deposition and glacial erosion, that a lot of our present day landscapes really were modified in the last ice age by the glaciers that covered a large portion of the Earth's surface. So glaciers are part of both the hydrologic cycle and the rock cycle. Water, the hydrosphere, is constantly cycled through the atmosphere, the biosphere, the living organisms, as well as the geosphere on Earth. And so water evaporates from the oceans, it goes up into the atmosphere, it precipitates back on land, flows in rivers, flows underground, back to the sea. But when that water falls at high elevations or high latitudes, the water doesn't initially make its way to the sea. It's going to become part of a glacier. And although that ice will eventually melt, water can be stored in the ice of a glacier for tens, hundreds, or even thousands of years. And during that time, that water in the form of ice is a part of that glacier. This mass of moving ice can do a lot of work shaping the landscape. So there are different types of glaciers. One of those types is called valley glaciers or alpine glaciers, and these are going to exist in high mountainous areas. And valley glaciers can be long or short, they can be wide or narrow, they can be single, or they can have tributaries that branch out. Generally, they are longer than they are wide. So now we'll have a video that's going to take us on a tour of some glaciers.
Who in the world would go to Arizona to see the work of glaciers? I would. The San Francisco peaks sit a mile above Flagstaff, 12,633 feet above sea level. During the Quaternary, ice carved their highest ridges into bowls called cirques like this one. Later, after the climate warmed and glaciers disappeared, the peaks were littered with lines of loose rock called moraines, evidence of the glacier's passage. Of course, more northerly states like New Hampshire, Michigan, and Washington were covered by much larger areas of ice. But to see modern glaciers, we should head even further north. On this field trip, we'll look around Alaska and learn about different types of glaciers. We'll study how solid ice manages to move. And we'll see that ice creates glacial landscapes, both by eroding and by depositing rocks. Here's a map of Alaska. A few of the state's glaciers are found high in the Brooks Range and in the Alaska Range. But most are further south, close to the Gulf of Alaska. You see, it's not enough to be cold. Glaciers can only grow where temperatures are consistently cold and where there's plenty of snow, the raw material for glacial ice. For instance, the Alaskan interior around Fairbanks gets terribly cold in winter, but it remains glacier-free because there's just not enough precipitation. The mountains above Juneau, though, are cold enough in winter and receive 100 feet of snow every year, so many glaciers are born in this Juneau ice field. Glaciers form over many years in regions where more snow falls in winter than melts in summer. They're bodies of ice that move under the influence of gravity. It's possible that movement could happen if a glacier just slid downhill as an intact block of ice. But a glacier is more complicated than that. As snowflakes fall high on a glacier, their cumulative weight compresses previously fallen snow. Individual flakes gradually change into rounded granules that eventually recrystallize into larger interlocking crystals of ice. As the glacier grows thicker, crystals begin to slide over one another, and the ice moves downhill as it deforms internally, slowly flowing like silly putty. Glacier formation requires cold temperatures, adequate precipitation, both cold temperatures and adequate precipitation. Alaska has a handful of huge ice fields like Juneau, Bagley, and Harding. These are not as massive as ice sheets in Antarctica or Greenland, but they're big, some several thousand feet thick and covering hundreds or even thousands of square miles. There are also a couple of massive Piedmont glaciers like the Bering and Malaspina near Yakutat, which rest on flat ground along the coast. They're fed by numerous small glaciers descending from the St. Elias Range. Valley glaciers are far more common in Alaska. These form in mountains and flow downhill, abrading the bedrock like a giant rasp and plucking boulders from the valley floor. They carve valley floors into a smooth U-shape called a glacial trough. By way of contrast, rivers in mountainous areas typically focus their cutting power on relatively narrow streams, thus carving V-shaped valleys. The surface of a glacier is often a tortured landscape. As ice flows around a bend or over an obstacle, it's stretched and torn into crevasses. These cracks, in the brittle upper portion of a glacier called the zone of fracturing, may extend down from the surface 100 feet or more. During summer, the part of a glacier at lower elevation begins to warm, and meltwater begins to flow. The water either makes its way to the glacier's edge or falls into ominous moulins, manholes that drain into the glacier's mysterious inner plumbing. Ultimately, this water will flow under and then out from beneath the glacier, emerging as a milk-colored stream carrying vast quantities of finely ground sediment called rock flour. Rocks frequently tumble down the walls that enclose a valley glacier. Sometimes big landslides will roll far out onto the glacier's surface. These two landslides rumbled onto Buckskin Glacier in Denali National Park. If you were looking down from the plain 10 years later, you would see that the middle of the glacier has been moving faster than its sides. More often, individual rockfalls pile up along the glacier's edge to become a sinuous ridge of loose material called a lateral moraine, which can be left behind after the ice has vanished. When two valley glaciers flow together, their shared lateral moraines are carried along as a single medial moraine. When the front of a glacier is stationary, it dumps an unsorted mix of rock debris at the terminus. This ridge of till is called an end moraine. Some individual boulders, called erratics, are left stranded after a glacier melts. So back in New Hampshire, or even Arizona, when you stumble on an isolated boulder of an unexpected rock type, it might be worth asking, did a glacier once carry this boulder here? A glacier that manages to flow all the way to the sea before melting is called a tidewater glacier. These usually don't extend seaward as large floating ice shelves, as happens in Antarctica. Instead, upon reaching the ocean, Alaskan tidewater glaciers tend to calve icebergs close to the shore. The end moraine often protects a tidewater glacier from rough water of the open ocean that would otherwise hasten its retreat. You might be surprised that most glaciers in Alaska are considered warm, because, unlike Antarctica or Greenland, their ice is always within a few tenths of a degree of melting. At the South Pole, temperatures are so low that ice there exists well below the melting point. These cold glaciers are frozen to the bedrock on which they rest. The warm glaciers of Alaska, on the other hand, have a thin layer of water separating ice from rock. As a result, they're able to slide downhill far more rapidly than cold glaciers, sometimes hundreds of feet per year. Because of this difference in speed, the ice of an Alaskan glacier is likely to be only a few hundred years old, while ice in Antarctica might be 500,000 years old. As glaciers move downhill, they descend from high cold regions to lower warmer conditions. A glacier will advance as long as, overall, it accumulates ice faster than it melts. If the snow up above has been accumulating at exactly the rate that ice is melting down below, the glacier is in equilibrium and the terminus remains stationary. But if regional snowfall decreases or the atmosphere becomes warmer, then the equilibrium shifts and the glacier begins to retreat. This is the case for most modern glaciers in Alaska. In the lower 48, Glacier National Park in Montana may soon have no glaciers because there, and worldwide, they're retreating as Earth's atmosphere warms at an alarming rate. Glaciers are all about ice and sediment heading downhill. Marjorie Glacier carries 1.25 million cubic yards of rock to the west arm of Glacier Bay National Park every year. Think of glaciers as one of the world's most powerful conveyor belts. Sediment carried by glaciers will ultimately find a resting place, maybe the bottom of the Gulf of Alaska, where it will pile up and eventually be transformed into sedimentary rock. As such, glaciers are an integral part of Earth's rock cycle, the continuous creation, destruction, and rebirth of rock. What did you learn?
So there you learned about some of the features associated with the valley glaciers that we see in Alaska. Now we'll turn our focus to ice sheets or continental glaciers. Ice sheets are much larger than the valley glaciers. They flow out in all directions from one or more snow accumulation centers and then pretty much completely obscure all but the highest areas of the terrain. If we look in today's time, each of our polar regions, both at the North Pole and the South Pole, supports an ice sheet. We have Greenland at the North Pole and Antarctica at the South Pole. If we look at what happened in the Ice Age, or the last Ice Age, about 18,000 years ago, glacial ice covered Greenland and Antarctica, but also large portions of North America, Europe, and Siberia. And this was called the last glacial maximum, the point at which we had, the last time that we had the maximum amount of glaciers, you could say. If we look at the North Pole, the ice that covers the Arctic Ocean is sea ice, which is frozen seawater, and it floats because the ice is less dense than the water below. And the area that's covering the North Pole, the Arctic Circle, is going to change with the seasons. It can expand and contract. The thickness of sea ice can be a few centimeters for ice that's just forming, up to 4 meters for sea ice that has been around for thousands of years. If we contrast that with our glaciers, they can be hundreds or thousands of meters thick. So you can see this here in this figure. So here's our North Pole, here's Greenland. So Greenland sits, or the uppermost portion of Greenland sits within the North Pole, but since there are no land masses here, we don't have ice sheets here in the North Pole. We have sea ice. But if we look at the South Pole, Antarctica does actually cover the South Pole. So we do have glacial ice or ice sheets that encircle the South Pole. So now we'll watch a couple of videos that walk us through ice sheets and ice caps.
For decades, scientists have been probing the Greenland ice sheet from the ground, air, and space. Now a new study uses those observations to see within the ice sheet, laying bare a tale more than 100,000 years in the making. When we look inside an ice sheet, we can see distinct layers formed by thousands of years of snowfall. As snow accumulates, these layers get progressively compacted into ice, which then flows under its own weight. To get a precise history of a particular spot on an ice sheet, scientists drill into it and recover ice cores, which provide a record of the ice's age and what the past climate was like. Seasonal variations, along with ash from volcanic eruptions, show up in the cores, allowing us to date the ice and correlate samples from different sites. To extend this age information across the ice sheet, the best tool that we have is ice-penetrating radar, mounted on aircraft flying low over the surface. Radar transmits electromagnetic pulses into the ice and records the reflected signals, allowing us to track the depth of the layers detected in the ice. Since 2009, NASA's Operation Icebridge has flown over Greenland more than 100 times with a wide variety of instruments, including radar, and produced vast quantities of data, adding to the work from many other missions. This has allowed researchers to generate a three-dimensional map depicting the age of the ice throughout the Greenland ice sheet. This 3D age map shows that three distinct periods of climate are evident within the ice sheet. The Holocene, shown here in green, the last ice age, shown in blue, and the Eemian, shown here in red. The top layers from the Holocene period formed during the last 11.7 thousand years and are fairly flat and uniform, though the thickness varies depending on how much snowfall occurred. Below this, deeper within the ice sheet, we see layers that formed during the last ice age. Layers from this period are darker and more complex, having been further squeezed and sometimes folded as they flowed over the rugged bedrock below. Deeper still are layers of ice left over from the warm period before the last ice age, more than 115,000 years ago. Eemian ice can reveal how the ice sheet responded to a period of warmth similar to the one we are experiencing today. Several ice cores have recovered Eemian ice, but it is difficult to interpret. This new map of the age of the ice sheet shows that there is more Eemian ice than expected in northern Greenland, where it may be easier for scientists to collect and analyze. This new analysis reveals a 3D map of the age of the Greenland ice sheet, from the oldest Eemian ice, to the layers deposited during the last ice age, to the ice that formed during the Holocene. The response of the ice sheet to past climate change led to its current age structure. Further study will help us better understand how the Greenland ice sheet will respond to today's changing climate.
Hello, I'm Michael Collier. We're over an island that straddles both a mid-ocean ridge and a mantle plume, so it's dominated by volcanoes. But even so, it's called Iceland. Iceland is located in the North Atlantic, just below the Arctic Circle. What do you get when a lot of snow falls on tall mountains at this high latitude? Glaciers, of course. And aptly named Iceland is no exception. Vatnajökull, Iceland's largest body of ice, covers more than 3,000 square miles, about 8% of the island. This ice cap is 1,300 feet thick, more in places, spilling out to the surrounding lower elevations in 30 outlet glaciers. Like much larger ice sheets, the Vatnajökull ice cap buries the underlying terrain, but it's a lot smaller than ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. Water from rain and melting percolates down through Vatnajökull's ice, flowing as subglacial streams. But what happens when a volcano erupts under a glacier? Lava that's 1,300 degrees Celsius can melt a lot of ice. This water and lava mixture often leads to violent eruptions, sending ash and cinders high into the atmosphere. In 2010, eruption of Eyjafjallajökull volcano belched an ash cloud that stretched thousands of miles. The ash crippled airlines by closing airspace across Europe. Alternatively, after subglacial volcanic activity, meltwater might pool up beneath the glacier, trapped until it suddenly breaks out as a massive flood called a Jökullaup. When Grímsvötn erupted in 1996, it set off a Jökullaup well in excess of 1 million cubic feet per second. In 1755, nearby Katla volcano set off a flood that was 4, maybe 8 times as large. That's like waking up and finding a couple of Amazon rivers flowing through your backyard. Ice caps like Vatnajökull are smaller than the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland. larger than the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, roughly the same size as ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland. An ice cap, like Vatnajökull in Iceland, is smaller than the ice sheets found in Antarctica and Greenland, which tend to be 20,000 square miles and more.
Something else that you'll notice associated with ice sheets are these ice shelves, and you can see a couple of them here on this map of Antarctica. This is when glacial ice flows into the ocean, and they are large, relatively flat, and they're actually pieces of floating ice. They extend seaward, so they're going out into the sea, but they actually remain attached to land on one or more sides, as you can kind of see here if we look at the Ross ice shelf. These are the largest in Antarctica. There are more. The Ross ice shelf covers an area about the size of Texas. So it's kind of floating there in the ocean, but still attached to land. So now we'll switch gears and talk a little bit about how glaciers are going to move. So there are two basic types of ice movement. We have plastic flow, which is movement within the ice, and then we have the slipping along the ground. So if we look at plastic flow, ice is going to behave as a brittle solid until the pressure on it is equivalent to the weight of about 50 meters, which is 165 feet of ice. So it stays as a solid and it doesn't move. But once it gets that much pressure on it, ice starts to behave as a plastic material and begins to flow. This occurs due to the molecular structure of ice. The other type is when, like I mentioned, the entire mass of ice slips along the ground. So the uppermost portion, the uppermost 50 meters of the glacier is called the zone of fracture. And so this upper part is the brittle ice, and that's where we see those crevasses that can form, like are shown for you on page 313. But the ice below, or the ice in this zone, is carried along by the ice below. And so we have both plastic flow and that slipping along the ground. And so here is a crevasse. This is the figure from page 313 in your book. So what happens is the zone of fracture, so that upper portion is subjected to cracks as tension is created by the glacier moving along land. And so we get these huge cracks or fractures that form in the ice. Now, the movement of glacial ice, of course, is not obvious. We can't observe the movement of glaciers like we do the movement of rivers, for instance. All of the ice does not move at the same rate. Flow is greatest in the center because as it's moving, there's going to be drag that is occurring on the sides of the ice by the mountains or the landscape around it. So looking at what we call the glacial budget, this is the balance between accumulation at the upper end of the glacier and the loss at the end of the glacier. And we're going to watch a short video on that now.
Hello, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to describe what influences the glacial budget. Glaciers flow downhill. This is a important realization to have in this discussion, because we're going to watch the front of the glacier, the downhill end called the terminus, and that terminus is going to move, and it might move downhill or it might move uphill, but all the time the glacier is flowing downhill. The glacier has two regions that we need to pay attention to. Uphill is the zone of accumulation, where more snow falls each winter than melts off each summer. At the bottom end of the glacier is the zone of wastage, where all the snow from the previous winter melts, as well as some of the glacial ice itself. So whether the zone of accumulation ends up gaining more snow each winter, or whether the zone of wastage ends up melting more glacial ice each summer, ends up determining whether or not the glacier ends up growing or melting back. One form of wastage is simply melting, where the ice turns to water. Another form of wastage is what's called sublimation, where ice directly goes into the gas phase. That happens in really dry regions. And then there's also the possibility of calving icebergs. So some glaciers flow out to sea, and there they form ice shelves, and those ice shelves can break off, generating icebergs. The process of generating icebergs is referred to as calving. What would happen to a glacier which experiences first an increase in its glacial budget? In other words, the zone of accumulation gains more than is lost at the zone of wastage, and then undergoes a reversal of fortunes where the zone of accumulation ends up gaining less snow and the zone of wastage ends up losing more. What would end up happening to that glacier? Okay, you've had a moment to think about it. So I think first off, you would end up seeing that the glacier would advance because, again, there's more going in at the top end than is being lost at the bottom end. So the glacier grows. It might end up depositing a nice end moraine there as it grows. And then comes the period of time where there's less being added in than is being lost at the bottom end. So there's less accumulation and more wastage. At that point, the glacier is going to retreat. So the terminus of the glacier is going to back up, even though the glacier itself is flowing down the mountain the entire time. A new end moraine will be generated. And then, of course, the glacier might end up melting off entirely. And just by looking at the position of those two end moraines, we can end up deducing its history. Thanks very much for your attention. This has been another Smart Figure.
So as you learned, glaciers will retreat if we have a disequilibrium in the glacial budget, or the glacier could advance. So when we look at this image here and we look at the zone of accumulation versus the zone of wastage, we have to look at what is the balance or lack of balance between the two. And as you learned, if ice accumulation exceeds wastage, then the glacial front advances until the two balance. If the warming trend interferes with the wastage, so it increases wastage, or it leads to a drop in snowfall, then the ice front, the glacier, will retreat. And as the terminus of the glacier retreats, then the extent of the zone of wastage diminishes, and we'll get into a new balance. Whether the margin of the glacier is advancing, retreating, or stationary, the ice is still going to move forward. In the case of a receding glacier, the ice flows forward, but not rapidly enough to offset wastage. Of course, we know that glaciers are sensitive to temperature changes, to changes in precipitation, and so they can provide clues about climate to us. This image shows retreating glaciers. So this is the same vantage point along the southwest coast of Greenland. And so there's a picture in 1935 versus 2013, and you can see that the area covered by the glacier has been drastically reduced. The outlet glacier here, that's the primary focus, retreated about 2 miles. And then, like I mentioned the other day in class, in Glacier National Park in Montana, 150 years ago, there were 147 glaciers, and now only 37 remain. So now we'll look at some features that we will find associated with glacial erosion. So when glaciers erode, they move tremendous amounts of rock. The ice will scrape, scour, and tear rock debris from the floor and the walls of the valley as it's moving, and all of that will be carried down valley. In mountainous regions, we also get mass movement processes that can contribute to the sediment load of a glacier. Once a glacier acquires rock debris, that debris doesn't settle out like it would if it was carried along by a stream or by the wind. It's just caught up in the glacier and is just going to move along as the glacier moves. Today's glaciers, of course, don't cover as much land, and so they are not as important in modifying landscapes now. But from the last ice age and previous ice ages before that, we can see how land masses really still bear the scars, essentially, of glacial erosion. So glacials are going to erode in two main ways: plucking and abrasion. As the glacier flows over the bedrock surface, it's going to loosen and lift blocks of rock, and those become incorporated in the ice. This is called plucking. Meltwater penetrates the cracks and joints along the rock floor of the glacier. It freezes, and we know water expands as it freezes. And as that happens, as we looked at with mechanical erosion that we talked about a few chapters ago, we know that rocks break loose. And so as those rocks break loose, they get caught up in the glacier. So sediments of all sizes can become a part of the glacier's load. The second process we see is abrasion. The ice and rock fragments essentially act like sandpaper as they move over the bedrock floor. And so they're smoothing and polishing the surface below. We get rock flour, which is the pulverized rock. And we can also get striations, which are the grooves and scratches that occur in the bedrock as these large rocks that have been plucked and lifted into the glacier scratch into the surface of the bedrock. Now, sometimes the abrasive action also produces very smooth surface or very polished surfaces. The rate of erosion that we see is highly variable. It's controlled by four factors: the speed, so how fast the glacier is moving, the thickness of the ice in the glacier, the shape, abundance, and hardness of the rock fragments that are in the ice, and then the erodibility of the surface beneath the glacier. So those are the four things that we have to consider when we look at erosion. So in this image here, you can see some scratching. So this would be caused by abrasion. And you see these grooves and scratches in the underlying bedrock here. And then in this particular example, we see kind of the smoothness of the granite here. So we do have, a few scratches that we see here, but a lot of the surface is very fine and smooth. So we get both of those scenarios when we're looking at glacial abrasion. Now we can also get specific landforms that are caused by glacial erosion. And these are going to depend on whether we're looking at erosion by valley glaciers or erosion by ice sheets. In a glaciated mountain region, we tend to see more sharp and angular topography. The valley glaciers tend to accentuate the regularities in the mountain landscape by creating steeper canyon walls and making the peaks that are sticking out even more jagged. But continental ice sheets override the entire terrain, and they subdue rather than accentuate the irregularities they encounter. So valley glaciers tend to accentuate and make things almost more rugged and more harsh, whereas the continental ice sheets subdue those harsh peaks and those, rockier landscapes. So now we're going to see a short smart figure that goes over all of these different types of landforms that can be created by glacial erosion.
This is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another smart figure. After watching this video, you should be able to identify and describe erosional glacial landforms that occur in areas of alpine glaciation. Here's a look at an area of alpine glaciation. This is Piteau Lake in the Canadian Rockies, and you can see a bunch of awesome glacial features here. You'll note the U-shaped valleys that are very prominent in this image, including some small ones that feed into the larger ones. Where those U-shaped valleys intersect, you end up getting these sort of knife-edge ridges, and you see a pointy little mountain here in the background. The lake itself is a glacial feature. Let's take a look at all of these. So the Canadian Rockies probably started off as a landscape that would look something like what you see in this picture. There would be stream-cut valleys, which have a V-shaped profile. But then the climate got colder, the valleys filled with snow, the snow packed into ice, and the ice began to flow. This made glaciers. And those glaciers eroded into the rock that they flowed over, and they carved it into new shapes. After the glaciers melted away, those shapes remained, and you can see some of them here. Here's that pointy mountain with the faceted sides. That's called a horn. The sort of amphitheater-shaped features up at the top of these small valleys are referred to as cirques, because they kind of call to mind a circus or a circle. If you find a small lake in a cirque, you might call it a tarn. If one tarn flows into another, which flows into another, that whole string of lakes is referred to as a set of pater noster lakes. And then, of course, there's the main glacial valleys themselves, which are U-shaped. The intersection of those U-shapes can produce the knife-edge ridges known as arêtes, and where the arêtes abruptly truncate against the main glacial trough, you see truncated spurs. Let's take a look at what happens where a river flows out of a hanging valley and into the main glacial trough. That ends up frequently producing spectacular waterfalls, like this one here in Yosemite National Park. See the U shape of the hanging valley that hosts that river? That U-shaped theme appears again and again. Here's a cirque, and you can see that it is U-shaped in profile. And then up above is an arête. You can see the edge of one U-shaped valley leading up to that arête. If you were to draw what this arête looks like from a cartoon kind of perspective here, you've got two U-shaped valleys intersecting with one another, and the pointy knife-edge ridge that separates them is referred to as an arête. Let's see what we can identify here in this picture. This is looking at an alpine glacial landscape, and you can see some of these erosional features. Hopefully you notice the U-shape to the valleys. You can also see here's a little tarn, and it looks like there's a drainage that goes into another little tarn, which goes into this bigger tarn here. That would be a series of pater noster lakes, okay, like beads on a string. Off in the distance here, you can see the knife-edge ridge of an arête separating one glacial valley from its neighbors. And there's some mountains in here that have vaguely faceted slopes, not really classic-looking horns, but perhaps you could call that a horn as well. All right, nicely done. Hope you identified those features. There are many more to be found in your textbook. Thanks.
So there you got a look at some of these erosional landforms. Another erosional landform that you can see at the bottom of page 319 are fjords. Fjords are steep-sided inlets of the sea that we see in a lot of high latitude areas of the world. They are glacial troughs that became submerged. So as you saw those, U-shaped glacial troughs, if they become submerged due to the rise in sea level, then they basically create this series of inlets that you can see there around the coast of Norway. that are pretty spectacular. You see, there's a group of people there resting, on top of one of these sides of a fjord with the sea kind of coming in below it. Now, in addition to glacial erosion and the landforms that we can see due to the erosional effects of glaciers, we also have depositional effects of glaciers. So when the glacier picks up and transports rock, when it advances and the ice melts, all of those materials are going to be deposited. And of course, they play a role in forming the landscape. So we call this glacial drift. This is the term that we use for all sediments of glacial origin, no matter how, where, or in what form they were deposited. Then we divide glacial drift down into two types: till, which are materials deposited directly by the ice, so directly by the glacier, and then the sediments that are deposited by the meltwater from a glacier are called stratified drift. So here's an example of glacial till. So this is going to be what is deposited by the ice itself. So the ice melts and just drops out its load of fragments. Ice cannot sort the sediment that it carries, so the deposits of till are unsorted mixtures of many different particle sizes. The pieces are scratched and polished as they're dragged along by the glacier. Boulders that are found in the till or lying free are called glacial erratics if they're different from the bedrock down below. And so this tells us that they have to have been derived from a different area and then deposited there by some force. Well, we know that water and wind can't move particles the sizes that glaciers can. So we know that these have to have been deposited by glaciers. So we call that, we call those glacial erratics. So let me go back here. Okay, so stratified drift is sorted. And so this tells us that it had to have been deposited by water. So this is coming from glacial meltwater. Some deposits of stratified drift are made by streams that come directly from the glacier. Other stratified deposits involve sediment that was laid down by till, and then some of the smaller pieces were picked up and transported elsewhere. The stratified drift consists largely of sand and gravel, so those smaller pieces, because the water can't transport the larger pieces like the glacier can. So other types of depositional features that we can get are moraines. Moraines are just layers or ridges of till. And we have lateral moraines and medial moraines, and we find those only in mountain valleys. End moraines and ground moraines we can find in areas where we have both valley glaciers and ice sheets. So lateral moraines are found along the sides of the valley. This is basically debris that's coming in from the valley wall. And then medial moraines form in the middle, as you saw in that video that we watched of the Alaskan moraines. When we have these two valley glaciers that form together, we get a moraine right down the middle between where those end up. Then we have end moraines, which is the ridge of till that forms at the terminus of a glacier or ice sheet. And so this figure here shows you the end moraines that we have in the Great Lakes region from the most recent glacial advance. And we were talking about that last glacial maximum. So you see here in red are all of the end moraines. So this shows us where ice, where the glaciers were in the last ice age. Some other depositional features that we can have are ground moraine. We can get outwash plains, kettles, drumlins, eskers, and kames. We looked a little bit at these when we worked on our lab last week, but now we'll watch a tutorial that walks us through all of these different types.
Hi there, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to identify, name, and describe the formation of a bunch of different depositional glacial landforms. These are glacial landforms that occur in areas of continental glaciation. Now, if you want to see where continental glaciation is taking place today, you've got basically two big options, Greenland and Antarctica. These two locations are the only places on Earth today where there are ice sheets. However, if you were to go back in time to around 18,000 years ago, you'd find that there were several other major ice sheets, including one that covered most of North America and others in Siberia and Northern Europe. These ice sheets leave behind characteristic landforms that we refer to as depositional landforms because they're made out of glacial sediment. So you can see here over on the far right, there's an end moraine, which marks the furthest point that the glacier made it out to. So we can call this a terminal end moraine. If the glacier retreats a bit, it can leave behind a recessional end moraine as well. And then it can retreat some more and leave behind this big area of ground moraine, which has various landforms in it. You can see some kames here, little piles of till. There are braided rivers crossing this landscape. There are even the casts of old rivers that ran through the glacier. These are referred to as eskers. They look kind of like long snakes crossing the landscape. And there are also drumlins. Drumlins have a big upside-down spoon kind of shape, steeper on one side and gentler on the other. Here's an example from New York State near Rochester. You can see that there's a bunch of drumlins there. Here's a topographic map depicting those drumlins. Notice how on their northern end they have very closely spaced contour lines, and that indicates that that's a very steep section. Whereas on the southern portion, the contour lines are more widely spaced apart, and that indicates that it's more gently sloping there. That's basically a way to read ancient ice direction. In this case, the ice was flowing from the north towards the south. Another feature that we discussed were end moraines. Here's a look at the American Midwest. There's two generations of end moraines depicted on this map. An earlier generation in purple, and then that's mostly overprinted by a younger generation, which is shown here in red. Notice that the younger generation tends to parallel the shapes of the Great Lakes, so the shorelines of the Great Lakes are matched by end moraines that are recessional end moraines. So the Great Lakes were carved out, in fact, by glaciers, lobes of that great continental ice sheet. End moraines can also be found in the east. You can see some over here on the shores of New York and New England. Okay, let's see which of these you can identify here in this picture. We've taken away the labels now. Take a moment to see what you can spot.
So if we look at this figure, we can see all of the different glacial features here. We have our end moraines here, these ridges that we see here. We have a couple of kettle lakes in here. We have a braided river that's going to run right through here. Our outwash plain where all of that water is flowing. Our drumlins appear on the top, some of those kames down here, and all of this in here would be our ground moraine. Then we have an esker, kind of the scar that remains of a river there, streams, flowing below the glacier. And then here is our retreating glacier. So before we move away from glaciers, we're going to take a look at some other effects that we have from the ice age. as the ice advanced and retreated, we know that animals and plants either migrated or they died. And a number of plants and animals became extinct because they weren't able to migrate in time or migrate to another area. Something else that we see is crustal subsidence and rebound. So in areas that we had that were major centers of ice accumulation, like in Scandinavia or in northern Canada, the land has actually been rising over the course of several thousand years because it had down warped so much under the weight of all of the glaciers. And as those glaciers have receded, now the crust is kind of rebounding. It's actually been rising. We had, worldwide changes in sea level. The fall and rise of sea level accompanies advance and retreat of glaciers. We know that the snow that forms glaciers comes from evaporation of ocean water. We know that from studying the hydrologic cycle or water cycle, that the growth of ice sheets would have caused a drop in sea level. And then as the ice sheets melted, we would have seen a rise in sea level. And there's a smart figure that takes a closer look at this change in sea level.
The growth and decay of ice sheets significantly influences sea level and the configuration of coastlines. During the last glacial maximum about 18,000 years ago, sea level was about 100 meters, more than 300 feet, lower than at present. As you can see, the position of the coastline looked very different from today's. Here's a map of what North America would look like if present-day ice sheets were to completely melt.
So this is pretty interesting that we see that, the continent essentially gets smaller if we have melting of the ice sheets. And so if today's ice sheets melted, you could see that we would lose, a lot of the eastern seaboard now be in the ocean. We'd lose Florida completely. We would lose, pretty much all of Louisiana. And, we would be right on the edge of the sea here in DeQueen. You can see what happens in New England. There's a giant lake here in California. So, when we talk about the melting of glacial ice and of these ice sheets due to global warming, it does pose a real problem with our coastlines. Some of the other effects that we see from the Ice Age glaciers, changing rivers. If we look at the courses of rivers today, they bear little resemblance to their pre-glacial routes. This is shown for you on page 325. The Missouri River actually once flowed northward toward Hudson Bay in Canada. The Mississippi River went through central Illinois. The head of the Ohio River reached only as far as Indiana. But now, if we, look at the present day pattern, we see that ice sheets really play a role in changing this. Ice sheets and alpine glaciers act as dams and can create lakes. So we call these proglacial lakes. And that refers to their position just beyond the outer limits of a glacier or an ice sheet. At the bottom of page 325, you see this glacial lake Agassiz, and then the remnants that we have of that today. And then we have pluvial lakes. So the formation and growth of the ice sheets was a response to changes in climate, but the existence of the glaciers themselves triggered climate changes in their region, in their vicinity, and then even beyond their region. If we look out west in some of the semi-arid and arid areas, temperatures were lower, evaporation rates were lower, but precipitation totals were moderate. And so we formed what we call pluvial pluvia referring to rain, so pluvial lakes. In North America, we see these in that basin and range area of Nevada and Utah. Most of them are gone now, but we do have the Great Salt Lake, which is one of the few that remain. So the glaciers, even though this particular area, this basin and range area, was not covered by glaciers, the vastness of the glaciers that we did have actually triggered climate changes, in regions outside of themselves. So now we're going to completely change gears and move from glaciers to deserts. So deserts are any areas that have a water deficiency. Okay, so when we talk about a dry climate, this is when there is a water deficiency that exists. So, a lot of times we think about glaciers being hot and full of sand, but that's not really the case. It's just any area where there is a water deficiency. Roughly 30% of Earth's land surface is covered with deserts. Deserts are also referred to as arid climates. We also have the steppes, S-T-E-P-P-E, steppes, that are semi-arid. It's kind of a marginal and more humid variant of the desert. It's basically the transition zone between the desert and forests, essentially. So now we'll have a smart figure about the distribution of deserts.
Hello, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to describe the two principal causes for the formation of deserts. This is a map showing the distribution of desert lands around Earth's surface. You'll notice that in the Americas, they tend to be located in the mountainous west. In Africa, there's two main belts, one in the north, one in the south. In the middle of Australia and in the middle of Eurasia, there are also very large desert regions. In every place, the desert regions are surrounded by steppe regions, which are semi-arid. Why do we find dry lands in these particular locations? There are two reasons. The first one is because of the circulation of air in Earth's atmosphere. Now, the equator gets hit most by the sun, which means it tends to produce lots of warm air, and that warm air rises away from Earth's surface. As it rises, it takes with it a load of water vapor, and that water vapor cools off at higher levels in the atmosphere, causing it to condense and then precipitate. So the tropics tend to be very warm and very wet. Now, the air, freshly devoid of water, ends up moving away from the equator in these big, large-scale convection cells. These tend to sink again at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. So this produces the so-called subtropical high. It's called high because it's a high pressure zone because of all that air cascading downward from higher levels in the atmosphere. Now, that air is very dry, so it tends to produce belts of desert in the regions where it sinks towards Earth's surface. This is certainly the case in Africa. In the famous blue marble image, you can see basically there's a large belt of desert that extends across northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, another belt of desert across southern Africa, and you'll notice, of course, there's no clouds in those regions either because there's very little water vapor in that descending air. And then along the equator, which runs through the middle of Africa about right there, there's lots of clouds, and in the few places where you can see below the clouds, there's dark colors indicating the forest that's growing thanks to all the rain that falls in that area. The other reason that we get deserts is due to the rain shadow effect. And this is certainly the case in California. In California, the source of the precipitation is that it's coming off the Pacific Ocean. So as it moves eastward off the Pacific, a little bit of precipitation gets wrung out as that air mass passes over the coast ranges of California. Basically, the mountains there force the air up to a higher elevation. At that higher elevation, it's colder. That causes water vapor to condense out of the air and potentially to precipitate. Then it passes over the relatively low-lying Great Central Valley, And because there's no obstacles there to force it up to higher elevation, you don't really have a whole lot of rain in the Great Central Valley. But then there is a very big obstacle indeed, and that's the Sierra Nevada mountain range. The air masses moving over the Sierra Nevada get forced up to really high elevations. That means that the water vapor is more likely to encounter cold temperatures and therefore to condense and potentially precipitate out of the atmosphere. By the time the air gets over to the far side of the Sierra Nevada, out into the Great Basin, basically has had all of its water vapor wrung out of it, and there are no more really high obstacles to extract rain from that air. As a result, the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada look very different from the eastern Sierra. Let's go ahead and take a look now at another U.S. state. This is the U.S. state of Washington. Eastern Washington state is an example of a desert. Does this look like it would be an example of a rain shadow desert or a desert that's due to the large-scale convection that is observed in Earth's atmosphere? Well, you've had a minute to think about that. It's not really right there on that subtropical high, and so you wouldn't expect this to be a desert caused by convection in Earth's atmosphere. However, we have very good evidence that suggests that this is in fact a rain shadow desert. As with California, the source of the water is coming off the Pacific Ocean in the air, and you can see when it encounters ranges of mountains, such as the Olympic Mountains or the Cascade Mountains, you see there's lots and lots of precipitation there. And as a result, eastern Washington is a desert because of the rain shadow effect. Thanks very much for your attention.
So from that video, you understand the two reasons or the two processes that lead us to have deserts. But if we look at a few other processes that take place in our arid climates or in our desert climates, we get what is referred to as dry region weathering. So we know that water plays a role in chemical weathering. So if we look at what happens in the desert, we know that chemical weathering processes are not as prominent because we don't have as much water. However, there is still some chemical weathering that does take place. But if we look at a lot of the debris in deserts, we see that it's unaltered rock and mineral fragments. So it's due to mechanical weathering, which makes sense. Rock weathering of any type is reduced because of the lack of moisture, and we also don't have the acids that are formed from plant matter that's decaying. We know that in deserts, we don't have as much water. We have scant precipitation, very few major rivers, but water can still play a role. We have what are called ephemeral streams. These are basically dry most of the time. They only flow during periods of rainfall, but this can lead to flash flooding. The ephemeral stream might flow a few days or maybe just even a few hours during the year, based on when the rainfall comes. And if you spend much time in the desert or in these dry areas, you'll know that a lot of times the roads will cross dry channels. There's not even really bridges or anything. The roads just go right over the dry channels because there's so few times when water is flowing. But typically in the desert, when rain does fall, it comes in heavy rainfall, heavy thunderstorms, which causes flash floods. Deserts have, poor drainage. And so most of the work of erosion is done by running water. Two of the most common terms that we use in the Western United States for these ephemeral streams or these beds are called washes and arroyos. And this past summer, when we were visiting some of these desert regions on our vacation, I ended up looking up the word arroyo because everywhere we went, we just kept seeing these arroyos, and I was like, what is this? And so I had to Google it and find out that it really was just a term that we use to refer to a stream bed that's dry, but that will fill up when there's heavy rainfall. And this is what this image is showing, and you'll see these flash flood signs around the desert, because when the rain does come, these clay soils don't soak up the water as quickly, so you get these massive flash floods that can result. Now, this next part of the chapter here talks about the basin and range area. And you've heard me mention this several times, and we've looked at this in other chapters, but dry regions typically are going to lack permanent streams, and they have interior drainage. So we don't necessarily have water that's flowing out to join rivers. They have a discontinuous pattern of ephemeral streams. They don't flow into major rivers. They don't end up in the ocean. And so in the United States, this basin and range area that includes Southern Oregon, Nevada, all of Nevada, Western Utah, Southeastern California, Southern Arizona, and Southern New Mexico. It's about 312,000 square miles. And we'll see that the water that flows through here in these ephemeral streams and from the rainfall contributes to the appearance of the landscape. And so we'll watch a smart figure that walks us through that.
Hello, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to describe the sequence of events that have taken place to produce the basin and range landscape, and also identify different features of that landscape. So this is what the basin and range looks like if you ever go there, and you definitely should go there because it's awesome. You can see that there is a big basin here in the middle of this view, and then off to the right there's a range, off to the left there's a range, and even in the foreground here we've got a small range. And you can see cutting across that foreground that there's some drainage. So there's both tectonic causes to this landscape, and also there are effects from weathering, erosion, and deposition of sediment. The basin and range is located in the American West, and you can see its distribution here on this map. Basically what's happened here is that tectonic extension has produced a series of north-south trending normal faults, and those have broken the crust up into a bunch of different little fragments. So these faults are normal faults. They're shown here in the cross-sectional view, and that breaks the landscape up. Notice that the blocks of crust that have dropped down relative to their neighbors have produced these basins, and the pieces of crust that are poking up into the sky are the new ranges. Now, as erosion goes to work on the ranges and transports sediment downhill into the basins, we get a couple of different features. Prominent are the alluvial fans. These are basically big piles of sediment that are produced where the canyons draining the mountains end up meeting the valley floor. If there are particularly low spots, may accumulate water, and that is present in the form of these playa lakes that you see here. If you let the landscape continue to evolve, the alluvial fans may coalesce to produce continuous aprons of sediment that basically drape the connection between the ranges and the basins. Those are called bajadas. And the lakes may dry up to produce these salt flats known as playas. If enough time goes by, the mountains may be reduced to little tiny nubbins, and they may poke up just barely through this sea of sediment. So those little nubbins that are poking up are called inselbergs. Let's take a look at some examples here. Here's a salt flat. This is the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. Here's an example of an alluvial fan. You can see it here leaving a range and entering a basin. Here's an example of several alluvial fans that have coalesced to form a bajada. And here's an example of an inselberg or two. So there's a prominent inselberg right here, but there's even a little one right here. Now let's take a look down on the most famous valley in the Basin and Range Province, and that's Death Valley. So in this perspective, north is off towards the right side of the screen. The bottom of the screen is the east, and the top of the screen is the west. And you can see here the Panamint Range on the west and the Amargosa Range on the east, and in between is Death Valley. Notice that there's this beautiful, well-developed bajada all along the western side of Death Valley. So that's all sediment derived from the weathering of the Panamint Range. On the eastern side, you don't see a bajada. Instead, you just see isolated little alluvial fans like the ones that we looked at earlier. Okay, time for a quick quiz. How many alluvial fans can you count here? Okay, so you had a moment to think about that, and hopefully you figured out that it was a trick question. Ha ha ha. So you might have said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different alluvial fans, but because they've all coalesced together here into a continuous apron of sediment, I would say there's no alluvial fans here, and instead that this is an example of a bajada.
So in that smart figure, you were able to get an idea of where this basin and range is and how it occurs, and how we get erosion that gives us this very unique landscape. So now switching gears again and moving into wind erosion. So moving air is similar to moving water. It's turbulent, it picks up loose debris, and it's able to transport it to other locations. We know that wind cannot really transport as heavy materials as water can, but it can transport fine particles in suspension, and heavier ones are carried in what we call its bed load or its suspended load. So we'll see here this image of wind suspended load and the movement of dust. So this is a satellite image. So here's from the Sahara Desert, and you see all of this dust that's been picked up by the wind blowing across the Red Sea and eventually going into Saudi Arabia. We'll see the same thing on the west coast of Africa as well, that sand is going to be picked up and carried all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to be deposited in the Amazon rainforest in South America. Now, there's, if you look on page 335 in your textbook, you'll see this picture, but right beside this picture, you'll see sand that's being transported. When we look at the ways that sand can be transported, or way that dust or any type of debris can be transported, we know that it can become part of its suspended load, but in order for that to happen, we have to first have an event called deflation. And deflation is the lifting and then removal of the loose material. Larger grains of sand are kind of rolled or skipped along the surface, and this is called saltation. And that's what you're seeing at the bottom of page 335, that the wind isn't necessarily picking up these larger sand grains, it's just blowing them, and they're just kind of skipping and rolling across the surface. The most noticeable results of deflation that we see are these shallow depressions called blowouts. And there's a picture of this on page 336, and these are very prominent in the Great Plains region. Basically, you've got an area where the ground surface was, but then wind erosion lowered the land surface there. So you can kind of see this higher platform where the vegetation is. And so you get a depression around that where the wind is picking up and moving the sand. We also get, or we can get the formation of this desert pavement. So this is figure 10.37 on page 336, and there's a short smart figure that goes along with this that we're going to talk about how this desert pavement forms.
Hello, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another smart figure. In this video, we're going to take a look at desert pavement, and after watching the video, you should be able to describe the two principal hypotheses that explain the formation of desert pavement. So what is a desert pavement? Well, it looks like this. Basically, sometimes when you go out into the desert, you'll find that there is a layer of pebbles and maybe cobbles too, but mainly pebbles and coarse-grained grit. and this covers up a layer of finer grained sediments underneath. So if you scrape away these pebbles, you'll find that underneath is not necessarily more pebbles, but maybe sand and silt or other fine grain sizes. One idea for how desert pavement forms relates to blowouts. Remember that blowouts are areas where the wind has scoured into sediment and removed a lot of it. So like here in this lower picture, that used to be the ground level there, and then the wind has scoured away all this material down below it. So how does that relate to desert pavement? Well, the idea is that you start off with a poorly sorted batch of sediment. So as you can see in the upper left here, we've got a bunch of pebbles mixed in with sand and silt. Then you let the wind blow on it, and the wind picks up the fine-grained stuff and carries it away. That means that it tends to concentrate pebbles in that upper region, basically as it washes away the finer-grained stuff and leaves behind the big stuff that the wind can't possibly pick up. By the time it ends up blowing away enough sand and silt that the pebbles are concentrated in a layer a centimeter or 2 centimeters thick, that layer ends up acting like a shield, a protective cap that ends up blocking further deflation. But in other places, there's a different hypothesis that is favored, and that is the idea that's illustrated here on the bottom, that we start off with a layer of pebbles, perhaps deposited by a stream or something like that, and then those pebbles actually end up trapping fine-grained sediment in the little spaces in between them, because there's slightly less wind energy there between the pebble grains than above them. And so they trap a little bit of sand and silt, and then over time, basically that trapping effect builds up a layer of fine-grained sediment underneath the coarse-grained sediment up top. So this idea is actually fundamentally different because it actually increases the volume of sediment over time, whereas the previous deflation hypothesis decreases the amount of sediment over time. So where does that leave us with an exposure like this one? If we were out in the desert and we wanted to figure out which of those two hypotheses produced this desert pavement, what would we do? Okay, well, you had a moment to think about it. I would suggest that you dig underneath the desert pavement. And if you find a poorly sorted deposit under there, then perhaps deflation produced that desert pavement. On the other hand, if you find just fine-grained sediments with no pebbles or cobbles scattered throughout it, then that would suggest the second hypothesis was the correct one. Good job. You are on your way to becoming a geological detective.
So now we'll look at wind deposits. So we don't see a lot of erosional landforms. We saw a couple that can be that can occur, with deflation and saltation, and then these blowouts. But typically, when we look at wind, we're looking at depositional landforms. So in some areas, we have these depositional landforms. We have two types, loess, which are these blankets of silt, which were actually once carried in suspension. So this was part of its load. And then we have ridges of sand called dunes. So if we look at loess, these are deposits of wind-blown silt that we see on the surface. Dust storms deposited this material over hundreds and thousands of years. When we look at the distribution of loess worldwide, we see that there are two primary sources, deserts and glacial deposits of stratified drift. The thickest and most extensive deposits occur in western and northern China, and they were blown there from those desert basins in Central Asia. Like you saw on the map, we have the Gobi Desert there, and so in China we had a lot of silt that was deposited. In the United States, we see deposits in South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. Unlike the deposits in China, though, the loess in the United States is an indirect product of glaciation. Its source is actually deposits of stratified drift. The next type of wind deposit we have are ones that, of course, we're much more familiar with, and that would be sand dunes. When Wind drops its load of sediment when the velocity falls, and then the energy available for transport diminishes. So sand begins to accumulate wherever there's an obstruction in the path. So as the wind has its sediment load, has its bed load, and it's picking up and carrying these particles, when it encounters an obstruction, the velocity diminishes, and so the energy diminishes, and the sand will just be dropped out there, and we get these, mounds or ridges that are called dunes. So when we look at a dune, we have several characteristic features. We have the slip face and the cross beds. So what we're going to do now to finish out this chapter is we're going to see two different smart figures, one on the actual formation of sand dunes, and then one on the different types of sand dunes.
Hello, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to describe the main mechanism by which wind moves sand dunes. One thing we know about sand dunes is that they don't stay put. They tend to move over time. And we also know that wind is capable of moving the very small grains of sand that compose a sand dune. If we happen to be near a sand dune on a windy day, we might actually even see sand grains moving. Here you can see little sand grains bouncing along the surface of the dune as they're carried along by wind. They're carried a short distance and dropped, and then they're carried a short distance and dropped. They're saltating over the dune surface. This is the way that wind moves dunes, one grain at a time. Wind blows over the gently sloped back sides of dunes and picks up sand grains there. Then in the lee of the dune, on the side that's facing away from the wind, where the wind energy is a little bit lower, new layers of sand grains are deposited on that face. That's called the slip face, because basically the sand grains are piled up there until suddenly they slip. This is what it looks like when they slip. There's a little avalanche that runs down the slip face of the sand dune. Many of these little avalanches end up being built out over time to produce what in cross-section appear as little lines. These are crossbeds, and we've seen crossbeds before when we studied sedimentary rocks. If the wind direction changes, say from left to right, back to right to left, then the direction of those crossbeds is going to change as well. So you can see some of the crossbeds here are inclined towards the right, and then the more recent set are inclined towards the left. Here's an example of some of these fossilized crossbeds. These are in the Navajo sandstone in Zion National Park. And you can see the main beds are units like this, and then within them are these beautiful crossbeds, which are inclined in the downwind direction. So basically these are the preserved slip faces of ancient sand dunes. Okay, to test yourself here, we've drawn a little Barkhan dune. Make a prediction about which way this dune is going to move if we let the wind blow on it. Well, Barkhan dunes form in a very specific orientation relative to the wind. So if you've studied that portion of the chapter, you know the wind's got to be blowing from the left towards the right, picking up sand off the back of the dune and then dropping it on the slip face. Over time, that's going to cause the dune to move. All right, so it's not moving as a single bodily mass, but one grain at a time, this dune is going to be moved from the left towards the right, from upwind towards downwind. Hi, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to name and describe the 6 major types of sand dunes. Okay, let's take a look at this scene here. Here some sand dunes are moving over some agricultural fields. But what kind of dunes are they? And what do they tell us about the region in which they are found? Well, there are 6 major types of dunes that we want to learn. The first is Barkhan dunes. Barkhan dunes are crescent-shaped. And the movement of this crescent is kind of like a Pac-Man, if you remember that video game. So basically the open part of the crescent, the concave part of the crescent, is the downwind part where the slip face is. So the wind moves up the back of these and then they advance towards that crescent shape. Now these are found in areas with a moderate supply of sand, but oftentimes they're moving over bare bedrock. Transverse dunes are linear dunes that form basically perpendicular to the wind direction, and these form in areas where there's more sediment than in Barkhan dune areas. So we've got a nice consistent direction to the wind, and we get these linear ridges. Barchanoid dunes are intermediate in their form between Barchan dunes and transverse dunes. Basically, they look like a bunch of Barchan dunes that have been lined up side by side. The next kind of dune we want to pay attention to are the longitudinal dunes, and they are parallel to the prevailing wind direction. So whereas transverse dunes form perpendicular to the prevailing wind, longitudinal dunes form parallel to it, except the wind direction actually has to vary a little bit. So sometimes it's from the west, sometimes it's from the south, sometimes it's from the southwest. The average wind direction is going to be parallel to these longitudinal dunes. Parabolic dunes are kind of a special case. They form in areas where the sand is somewhat anchored by vegetation, and oftentimes wind will be coming off of a body of water, a lake or the ocean, and it'll slam into these semi-stabilized dunes, and it'll create an area of blowout. So even though these are crescent-shaped, kind of like the Barchan dunes, here the slip face is on the convex side of the crescent. So the open mouth here is actually facing in the upwind direction, opposite from the Barchans. Finally, there are star dunes, which have lots of little ridges that emanate out from a central point, and these form in areas where the wind direction is variable. Okay, take a look here. Here's a little aerial photograph showing a beautiful landscape. What sorts of dunes do we appear to be looking at here? You might say it doesn't really look exactly like any of those pictures that we just looked at, but I think the one that comes closest is Barchanoid, because basically you can see these crescents that are steeply inclined, so those are downwind, and so therefore the wind must be coming from the back of the picture towards the front. But those crescents are all kind of lined up in a row in more or less linear ridges. So that indicates, I think, that the best name for these dunes would be Barchanoid dunes. Thanks very much for your attention. This has been another Smart Figure.